Decades ago, everyday life looked very different and far more dangerous than most people realized. From smoking on airplanes to kids riding in truck beds and toys laced with toxic materials. Many things once considered normal are now banned for good reason. These forgotten habits show how much society has learned about safety, health, and responsibility. Let's look at 30 things that were legal back in time to see how casual the world was. 1. Candy cigarettes. In the 1960s, kids could walk into a corner store, drop a few coins on the counter, and walk out with a small white box that looked almost identical to a real pack of cigarettes. Inside were candy sticks, chalky, sweet, and shaped exactly like smokes. Some even had a little red tip to look lit. For children, they were harmless fun. For parents, they were no big deal. But for tobacco companies, they were free advertising disguised as candy. It's hard to overstate how normalized smoking was back then. Adults lit up in restaurants, offices, airplanes, even hospitals. Kids saw it everywhere, on TV, in magazines, in their own homes. Candy cigarettes blurred the line between imitation and reality. They let children mimic grown-ups, puffing invisible smoke and pretending to exhale. It was play-acting addiction, without anyone realizing it. Studies later showed what common sense missed. Those early candy cigarettes helped shape attitudes toward smoking. Many children who played with them were more likely to pick up real cigarettes as teenagers. The candy industry denied responsibility, but the link was difficult to ignore. Health advocates eventually pushed for bans, arguing that marketing tobacco imagery to kids, even through candy, was unethical. By the 1990s, several countries, including Canada, the UK, and parts of the United States, had either banned candy cigarettes entirely or forced rebranding. The new versions dropped the word cigarette and came in bright, cartoonish packaging. They were simply called candy sticks. Even then, the resemblance lingered. Today, they still exist in a few places, tucked away as nostalgia candy, but the sight of a child pretending to smoke now feels unsettling. What once seemed like innocent play is now viewed as one of the earliest examples of how marketing could quietly shape public health habits. Candy cigarettes might have tasted sweet, but they left behind a bitter lesson about how easily imitation can influence behavior and how slow society can be to recognize it. 2. Kids riding without seatbelts or car seats. If you grew up in the 1960s or 70s, chances are you remember standing on the back seat of a moving car, leaning between the front seats, or even lying across the rear window ledge during long drives. Nobody thought twice about it. Kids bounced around freely, and parents believed that careful driving was all the protection they needed. Cars didn't come with the safety systems we take for granted today. Seatbelts were optional in many models, and child car seats were more like boosters for convenience than life-saving restraints. Their main purpose wasn't to protect a child in a crash. It was to help them see out the window. Even the design reflected that misunderstanding. Flimsy straps, thin padding, and plastic buckles that wouldn't stand a chance in a real collision. The results were tragic. As road traffic increased and speeds climbed, so did the number of children injured or killed in accidents. Doctors and safety researchers began collecting data that told a grim story. Most of these deaths were preventable. The idea of restraining children in cars wasn't new, but it took decades for the public to take it seriously. By the late 1970s, mounting evidence pushed lawmakers to act. States began introducing mandatory seatbelt laws, and manufacturers were required to install proper restraints in every car. The first true crash-tested child safety seats appeared soon after, built with reinforced shells and secure harness systems. Over time, the cultural shift was dramatic. What once looked normal, kids climbing over seats, waving out open windows, started to look reckless. Nowadays, child restraint laws are some of the strictest in traffic safety, and for good reason. A well-fitted car seat, or booster, can cut fatal injuries by more than half. Yet it's strange to think that only a few generations ago, safety inside a car was left entirely to luck and hope. 3. Super elastic bubble plastic toys. Long before slime kits and sensory putty took over toy aisles, there was something called super elastic bubble plastic. It came in small metal tubes that looked like toothpaste, filled with a thick, colorful gel. Kids would squeeze out a blob, roll it into a ball, stick a plastic straw in, and blow. The goo inflated into shimmering plastic bubbles, bright, stretchy, and totally mesmerizing. It felt like magic. What nobody realized at first was how toxic that magic really was. The gel was made from polyvinyl acetate dissolved in acetone, with a dash of ethyl acetate to make it pliable. Those chemicals evaporated fast, releasing fumes that were anything but harmless. Every time a kid leaned in to blow a bubble, they inhaled solvent vapors strong enough to cause dizziness, nausea, and headaches. Parents complained about the smell, but for years, stores kept selling it because it was cheap and popular. Another problem was flammability. The gel dried into thin sheets of plastic that could catch fire easily, and the leftover residue left sticky stains on furniture and clothes. Many parents found out too late that a fun rainy day toy could ruin a carpet, or worse, make their kids sick. By the late 1970s, consumer safety agencies began testing children's products more aggressively, and superelastic bubble plastic didn't survive the scrutiny. The chemical mix failed every modern safety standard. The solvents were reclassified as hazardous, and the toy was pulled from stores across North America and Europe. Looking back, it's hard to believe how casually dangerous some childhood toys were. What looked like harmless play was essentially chemistry, without supervision. Yet to those who grew up in that era, the memory still sticks. The smell of acetone, the sound of the straw crackling as the bubble grew, and that feeling of accomplishment before it popped. 4. Lawn darts. Jarts. Summer backyards in the 1960s and 70s had a game that looked harmless enough. Lawn darts, or as the packaging proudly called them, jarts. Each set came with a few plastic rings to mark targets and 4 heavy darts, about a foot long, with sharp metal tips designed to stick into the ground. The idea was simple. Toss the darts into the air and try to land them inside the rings. The problem was, they didn't always land where they were supposed to. Families played this game barefoot, surrounded by children and pets, often with zero caution. It didn't take long for the accidents to start piling up. Those darts came down with serious force, enough to pierce skulls, break bones, or cause fatal injuries. Hospitals saw a steady stream of emergency room visits linked to jarts, many involving kids who wandered into the line of fire. For years, the dangers were brushed off as user error. Manufacturers printed small warnings on the box, not for use by children, but the game was still marketed as a family backyard activity. It wasn't until the late 1980s, after several deaths and hundreds of severe injuries, that federal regulators finally stepped in. The U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission banned the sale of lawn darts in 1988, citing them as inherently hazardous. Even after the ban, some people tried to hold on to their old sets, claiming the danger added to the excitement. Others modified the darts by dulling the tips or replacing them with rubber ends, but the risk never really went away. To this day, you can find vintage yarts on auction sites, but selling or importing the real metal-tipped ones remains illegal. Modern lawn games like cornhole or ring toss carry the same competitive fun without the emergency room risk. Still, anyone who remembers playing jarts as a kid recalls the thrill and the close calls. It's one of those nostalgic games that feels funnier in hindsight than it ever did in real life. 5. Leaving children unattended in parked cars. In the 1960s and 70s, it was surprisingly common to see parents leave kids in the car while they ran errands. A quick stop at the grocery store or post office didn't seem like a big deal. The windows were cracked, the radio might have been playing softly, and adults assumed nothing bad could happen in 10 minutes. Nobody thought of it as neglect. It was just part of everyday life. What people didn't realize then was how fast things can turn dangerous inside a vehicle. Cars heat up quickly, even on mild days. A parked car can climb to over 100 degrees in minutes, and a child's body temperature rises 3 to 5 times faster than an adult's. Without air circulation, heat stroke sets in silently. It doesn't take long for confusion, dehydration, or worse to follow. Tragedies began drawing attention to the issue in the 1980s and 90s. Investigations revealed that many parents weren't malicious. They were simply unaware of how deadly a car could become. Safety campaigns began pushing a new message. Never leave a child alone in a parked car, not even for a minute. The phrase, "look before you lock," became standard advice for parents worldwide. Modern laws now treat this as a serious offense. In most U.S. states, leaving a child unattended in a car can lead to fines, charges, or even jail time if harm occurs. Some vehicles now have built-in rear seat reminders that alert drivers to check the back before exiting. Public awareness campaigns have turned what was once normal behavior into something socially unacceptable. It's easy to forget that older generations didn't have the same knowledge or technology we rely on now. There were no heat warning sensors, no child safety PSAs, and very little data on how quickly conditions can turn lethal. Parents genuinely thought a cracked window was enough. 6. Latchkey kids, children home alone. After school. In the 1970s and 80s, millions of children came home from school, turned the key, and stepped into an empty house. They were known as latchkey kids. Their parents worked long hours. Childcare wasn't as accessible or affordable as it is now, and neighborhoods were considered safe enough that no one worried much. Kids made their own snacks, watched TV, did homework, and sometimes didn't see an adult until dinner. It was independence by necessity, not by choice. At the time, people saw it as normal. Parenting books even praised self-sufficient kids for learning responsibility early. The idea of danger felt distant. Children were told to lock the door, not answer the phone, and stay inside until mom or dad got home. That was the extent of safety training. But as the years went on, stories began surfacing that shifted public perception. News reports of break-ins, house fires, and child abductions started raising serious questions about whether leaving young kids alone for hours was safe. Social workers and psychologists joined the conversation, pointing out that many latchkey children struggled with loneliness, anxiety, and a constant sense of vulnerability. By the 1990s, cultural attitudes had changed completely. Communities began creating after-school programs, and workplaces started offering more flexible schedules for parents. Laws in several states began defining what ages were acceptable for children to be left unsupervised, and in many places, doing so for long periods could now be considered neglect. Modern parents often look back at that era with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. There's something admirable about the independence those kids developed, but it's hard to ignore how much was left to chance. They learned to cook simple meals, care for younger siblings, and manage boredom, but they also carried responsibilities far beyond their years. 7. Smoking indoors and on airplanes. There was a time when lighting a cigarette indoors wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Restaurants, offices, buses, and even airplanes had ashtrays built right into the armrests. The smell of smoke hung in the air everywhere you went, and nobody questioned it. People smoked at work meetings, doctors smoked between patients, and flight attendants walked the aisles through clouds of secondhand smoke without a second thought. Airlines even divided planes into smoking and non-smoking sections, though the distinction didn't make much sense in a sealed metal cabin. The smoke drifted everywhere. Passengers complained of headaches and red eyes, but the habit was so deeply ingrained in daily life that few believed it could be harmful. Tobacco ads were still plastered across magazines and billboards, and celebrities endorsed cigarette brands like they were luxury products. It wasn't until the late 1970s and 80s that science caught up with culture. Studies began linking secondhand smoke to cancer, asthma, and heart disease. Public health organizations sounded alarms, and lawmakers started listening. The first bans on indoor smoking appeared in workplaces and restaurants, followed by complete restrictions on smoking during flights. By 2000, lighting up on a commercial plane was illegal almost everywhere in the world. The shift wasn't easy. Smokers protested, arguing it violated personal freedom. Bars and hotels worried they'd lose customers. But as air quality improved and illness rates dropped, public opinion changed. People began to realize how much smoke they'd been tolerating without question. Now, it's almost hard to imagine those days, sitting in a cafe filled with cigarette haze or boarding a plane with ashtrays built into the seats. What once felt normal now seems reckless. The cultural shift around smoking marks one of the biggest public health victories of the past century. 8. Riding bikes without helmets. For decades, riding a bike without a helmet wasn't seen as careless. It was just how things were done. Kids pedaled down steep hills, raced through neighborhoods, and cruised along busy roads with the wind in their hair and no thought of protection. Scraped knees and bruises were part of growing up. Helmets, if they existed at all, were bulky, expensive, and considered something only professionals or daredevils wore. Parents didn't insist on them, because hardly anyone else did. The local bike shop didn't advertise safety gear, and TV shows showed kids riding free and carefree. The focus was on fun, not safety. Unfortunately, those fun rides often ended in serious injuries, concussions, skull fractures, and lifelong Head trauma became the hidden cost of a carefree childhood. Doctors had been warning about head injuries for years, but public awareness didn't catch up until the 1980s. Studies showed that wearing a properly fitted helmet could reduce the risk of severe brain injury by more than 80%. The statistics were too clear to ignore. Slowly, advocacy groups, schools, and pediatricians began spreading the message. By the 1990s, laws started appearing across the US, requiring children to wear helmets while cycling. Some cities extended the rule to adults as well. Manufacturers responded with lightweight materials, ventilation designs, and bright colors that made helmets more comfortable and less stigmatized. What was once seen as uncool turned into a sign of smart riding. The cultural shift wasn't instant, though. Many adults who grew up without helmets resisted at first, insisting that they'd survived just fine. But data showed otherwise. Head injuries were among the most common reasons for emergency room visits related to biking. Over time, the message stuck. Schools, parks, and parents enforce it, and most riders can't do cycling without that layer of protection. Looking back, it's startling how long it took to normalize something so simple. The freedom of the open ride still exists, but now it comes with a little common sense on top. 9. Playing with mercury or uranium in toys and science kits. If you were a curious kid in the 1950s or 60s, your science kit probably came with something that would horrify parents today. Bottles of real chemicals, chunks of radioactive rock, and even liquid mercury. Back then, curiosity trumped caution. Adults believed hands-on learning was the best kind of education, and no one thought twice about a child experimenting with substances that belonged in a lab, not a living room. Mercury fascinated kids because it looked alive. The silvery liquid rolled across a table, broke into beads, and came back together again. Teachers used it to demonstrate density and surface tension. Students touched it with their bare hands, completely unaware that the vapors they inhaled could damage their nervous systems. The same spirit of experimentation extended to chemistry sets. Many included materials like potassium nitrate, sulfur, or even small uranium samples for radiation lessons, safety goggles, optional, ventilation, rare. Companies marketed these kits as wholesome ways to inspire future scientists. One of the most famous was the Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab, sold in 1950. It came with 4 real uranium ores, a Geiger counter, and instructions on how to measure radiation. The box proudly declared it was safe, though it was anything but. Parents saw atomic and thought educational, not hazardous. As research into toxic exposure and radiation risks grew, the charm faded. Mercury exposure was linked to brain and kidney damage, while handling uranium carried obvious long-term dangers. Schools and manufacturers began phasing out these materials in the 1970s, replacing them with harmless simulations and sealed demonstration kits. Regulations soon followed, banning the sale of hazardous substances to children altogether. These days, it's almost unbelievable that kids once played with poisons and radioactive minerals under the banner of science education. The memory is both fascinating and unsettling, a window into a time when curiosity was encouraged, but safety barely entered the conversation. 10. Dumping garbage in rivers and waterways. Before environmental protection became part of public policy, rivers and lakes were treated like bottomless trash cans. In the 1950s and 60s, factories dumped waste straight into nearby waterways, and households followed suit with their own garbage. Old furniture, cans, tires, and even animal carcasses were tossed into streams as if they'd simply disappear. The idea of pollution wasn't really part of everyday conversation. Once the current carried it away, it was out of sight and out of mind. The results were disastrous. Rivers that once supported thriving fish populations turned into foul-smelling, lifeless channels of sludge. Cities downstream suffered from contaminated drinking water, and wildlife died off in alarming numbers. In some places, the pollution grew so bad that rivers actually caught fire. The most infamous case was the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, which ignited multiple times due to oil and chemical waste floating on its surface. At first, the public didn't see it as a crisis. Industrial growth was booming, jobs were plentiful, and environmental awareness was low. But as photographs of black burning rivers began appearing in newspapers, attitudes shifted. Scientists, journalists, and activists started connecting pollution to human health problems, skin irritation, respiratory issues, and birth defects linked to contaminated water sources. By the early 1970s, the pressure reached lawmakers. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in the United States marked a turning point. The Clean Water Act followed soon after, making it illegal for companies and individuals to dump waste directly into waterways without treatment. Other countries passed similar laws, and the idea of environmental responsibility began taking root around the world. In this era, dumping waste into rivers is a criminal act in most places, carrying heavy fines and even prison time. Modern wastewater systems, recycling programs, and public education have dramatically reduced what once seemed like an unstoppable problem. Still, many rivers bear the scars of that careless era. Pollution that took decades to build doesn't vanish overnight. It's strange to think that what we now see as unthinkable was once an accepted part of daily life. The rivers may be cleaner now, but they'll always carry a reminder of how easy it is to take nature for granted. 11. Drinking at age 18, or younger, legally in many states. In the 1960s and early 70s, it wasn't unusual to see teenagers sitting at a bar or buying beer for a party and doing it legally. In many U.S. states, the drinking age was 18, and in some, even 16, for low alcohol drinks. The logic seemed simple. If you were old enough to vote, get married, or join the military, you were old enough to drink. Few questioned the rule, and enforcement was loose at best. Bars and liquor stores rarely checked IDs. A confident smile or a note from an older friend often worked just fine. College campuses had beer on tap at student events, and roadside taverns happily served young adults heading home from work. It was seen as a rite of passage, not a risk. But as cars got faster and highways busier, the consequences started piling up. Drunk driving crashes involving teenagers became alarmingly common. Hospitals and police departments began reporting sobering statistics. Alcohol-related car accidents were killing thousands of young drivers every year. What had been dismissed as harmless fun suddenly looked like a national problem. Public opinion started to shift in the late 1970s, when advocacy groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD, began campaigning for stricter laws. They argued that lowering the drinking age had created a dangerous mix of inexperience, alcohol, and access to cars. The evidence was hard to ignore. In 1984, the U.S. federal government passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, effectively raising the legal age to 21 across all states. Any state that refused risked losing federal highway funding. It was controversial at first, but within a few years, every state complied. Today, the idea of 18-year-olds drinking legally in bars feels almost unthinkable. Alcohol is tightly regulated, and underage drinking carries serious penalties. While some still debate whether 21 is too high, the drop in alcohol-related deaths after the change is undeniable. 12. Carrying guns to school, or hunting. Immediately after school. A few generations ago, bringing a rifle to school didn't raise eyebrows. In rural America, especially during the 1950s and 60s, it was perfectly normal for students to keep hunting rifles in their trucks or lockers. Many schools even had gun racks in the parking lot. After classes ended, kids would head straight into the woods to hunt deer, rabbits, or ducks before sunset. Teachers knew about it, and no one thought it was strange. Guns were seen as tools, not threats. They were part of daily life for farmers, hunters, and families living outside cities. Children learned how to shoot young, usually from their parents or local 4-H clubs, and were taught that handling a firearm was a sign of maturity. In small towns, nobody imagined that a gun at school could ever mean danger. But as society changed, so did the reality around firearms. Urbanization, rising violence, and a series of tragic school shootings in later decades shattered the assumption that guns in schools could safely coexist. What had once been a casual part of rural culture began to look reckless and dangerous. By the 1990s, zero-tolerance policies took hold. Federal laws banned firearms from school zones entirely, and the penalties became severe. Even possessing an unloaded rifle in a vehicle on school grounds could mean expulsion or arrest. The shift wasn't just legal, it was cultural. The sight of a gun near a classroom now triggers fear, not nostalgia. For many older Americans, It's a difficult change to comprehend. They remember a time when discipline and respect were enough to keep gun use responsible. But the world is different now. Population density, mental health awareness, and the availability of high-capacity weapons have turned an old tradition into a public safety concern. The idea of bringing a gun to school, even for hunting after class, would make national headlines. What was once a normal part of small-town life has become unthinkable. It's one of the clearest examples of how times change. The same object, the same intent, but a completely different world around it. 13. Fireworks like cherry bombs and M80s used casually in neighborhoods. In the 1960s and 70s, fireworks weren't limited to professional shows or backyard sparklers. Kids could buy serious explosives from roadside stands or corner stores. No permits, no adult supervision, just a few coins and a paper bag full of fun. The loudest and most famous were cherry bombs, M80s, and silver salutes. They were marketed as firecrackers, but in truth, many packed the same explosive power as military-grade devices. Every summer, neighborhoods sounded like war zones. Kids lit fuses in driveways, tossed fireworks into trash cans, or tied them to model cars just to watch them blow apart. Some people dropped them down storm drains to hear the echo. Accidents were so common, they barely made the news. Missing fingers, burns, and hearing damage were seen as part of growing up. Even pets were terrified for weeks around the 4th of July. Authorities knew these fireworks were dangerous, but regulations lagged far behind sales. Many were imported cheaply from overseas and sold without clear warnings or safety standards. By the late 1960s, hospitals began reporting thousands of serious injuries every year. The Consumer Product Safety Commission finally intervened in the 1970s, banning cherry bombs, M80s, and other oversized explosives for consumer use. Manufacturers tried to work around the ban by reducing powder content or renaming products. But the message was clear. The age of backyard dynamite was over. Legal fireworks became smaller, safer, and less powerful. The ones still available today are designed to pop or sparkle, not destroy mailboxes or shatter windows. Yet nostalgia lingers. Some older generations remember the thrill of lighting an M80 and running for cover, the adrenaline rush that came with danger. But that thrill came with real costs, thousands of injuries, fires, and lives changed forever by a few seconds of excitement. Modern fireworks laws may seem strict, but they've saved countless people from preventable harm. What used to sound like harmless fun was, in reality, an unregulated explosion waiting to happen. 14. Drinking while driving. Open containers. No enforcement. There was a time when cracking open a beer behind the wheel wasn't a scandal. It was just part of driving culture. In the 1960s and even into the 70s, it wasn't unusual to see a driver with one hand on the wheel and a drink in the other. Pickup trucks had six-packs rolling around the floorboards, and passengers passed bottles back and forth on long country drives. Police didn't see it as a big deal, unless the driver was clearly out of control. Some states had open container laws on paper, but they were loosely enforced or didn't exist at all. It wasn't just small towns either. People drove home from bars in big cities with a cigarette in one hand and a beer in the other. Cars even came with built-in ashtrays and dashboard coolers, small details that made drinking while driving feel normal. The dangers, of course, were enormous. Alcohol-related crashes claimed tens of thousands of lives every year. Newspapers often described them as tragic accidents, not crimes, because public awareness about drunk driving simply didn't exist. It wasn't until the late 1970s that advocacy groups began pushing for change. Organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADI, and Students Against Destructive Decisions, SADD, started highlighting the human cost, families torn apart, innocent lives lost, and a legal system that treated drunk driving like a minor mistake. Their campaigns worked. Lawmakers began rewriting traffic codes, making it illegal to have open alcohol containers in vehicles at all. By the mid-1980s, most U.S. states had passed strict drunk driving laws, and penalties grew far harsher. Open container laws are universal, roadside sobriety tests are standard, and designated driver campaigns are everywhere. Breathalyzers, car interlocks, and strict penalties have turned something once seen as casual into a serious crime. A culture that equated alcohol with relaxation didn't see the danger until it was too late. Those shifts in attitude didn't just change the law, they saved countless lives. 15. Riding in pickup truck beds with no belts or restraints. Not too long ago, riding in the back of a pickup truck felt like freedom. Kids, teenagers, even whole families piled into open truck beds for road trips, parades, and summer rides to the lake. Wind rushed through their hair. They laughed, waved at other cars, and no one thought of it as dangerous. In small towns, it was practically a tradition, an easy way to squeeze in a few extra people when the cab was full. But the danger was hiding in plain sight. Those open beds offered no seat belts, no padding, and no protection if something went wrong. A sudden stop, a sharp turn, or even a small bump could send passengers flying out. Many didn't survive the fall. In other cases, loose passengers were thrown from the truck during crashes, sometimes miles from home. For years, police and communities looked the other way. It was just how people rode. By the 1980s, accident statistics started changing minds. Studies showed that passengers riding in truck beds were nearly 8 times more likely to die in a crash than those inside the cab. Pediatricians and safety advocates called it one of the most preventable causes of child fatalities on the road. The message spread fast. Those fun summer rides weren't harmless. They were deadly. Lawmakers eventually stepped in. One state after another began banning passengers from riding in truck beds, especially children. Exceptions were made for farm work or parades, but casual rides became illegal almost everywhere. Today, seeing someone standing or sitting in the back of a moving pickup usually leads to a traffic stop. Despite the laws, some people still romanticize those old days. Windows down, tailgate down, nothing but air between you and the road. It's a powerful image of freedom, but one that came with a cost too high to ignore. Now, truck beds carry gear, not people. And while it might not feel as carefree, it's definitely safer. The open road is still meant to be enjoyed, but from inside the cab, where a seatbelt can do its job. 16. Toy guns that looked and worked like real firearms. Before bright orange tips and neon plastic designs became law, toy guns looked almost identical to the real thing. In the 1950s through the 80s, kids ran through neighborhoods carrying metal revolvers, replica rifles, and cap guns that made smoke and gunshot sounds. Movies and television shows glamorized cowboys, soldiers, and cops, and toy companies capitalized on it. For many kids, playing with realistic toy guns was as normal as riding a bike. The problem wasn't obvious at first. Parents saw toy guns as harmless imagination fuel, part of pretend play that encouraged bravery or adventure. But as cities grew and crime rates climbed, police officers began facing split-second decisions about whether a weapon was real. Tragic mistakes followed. There were countless incidents where a child or teen holding a toy was mistaken for someone armed, and those encounters often ended in disaster. Even before that, the toys themselves caused issues. Many fired plastic pellets or explosive caps that could injure eyes or ears. Some even used blank cartridges that produced real muzzle flashes. Safety warnings were minimal, and most packaging emphasized realism as the selling point. The more lifelike the toy, the better it sold. By the late 1980s, public outcry and law enforcement pressure forced change. The U.S. introduced federal regulations requiring toy guns to have bright orange tips or transparent bodies. Manufacturers shifted toward fluorescent colors and soft materials, making it immediately clear what was a toy and what wasn't. Other countries followed suit, banning ultra-realistic replicas altogether. Still, the debate continues. Airsoft and replica firearms remain popular with hobbyists and collectors, but strict safety rules govern where and how they can be used. In public, even a toy can lead to serious consequences if mistaken for a weapon. 17. Drop-side cribs and unsafe baby furniture. For decades, drop-side cribs were seen as every parent's convenience. The idea was simple: a rail that slid down so you could easily lift your baby in and out without straining your back. They looked elegant, worked smoothly, and became a staple in nurseries across America. Almost every new parent had one. What no one realized was that the very design meant to make life easier was also quietly putting infants at risk. The sliding mechanism was the weak point. Over time, the plastic hardware or metal tracks could loosen, creating small gaps between the mattress and the crib frame. Those gaps turned deadly. Babies could slip through, become trapped, or suffocate. Between the 1990s and 2000s, hundreds of injuries and dozens of infant deaths were linked to drop-side cribs, yet many parents still trusted them. They were beautifully built and had been around for years. How could they be unsafe? It took years of investigation and heartbreaking stories before regulators acted. In 2011, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission banned the sale, manufacture, and resale of drop-side cribs. The law also required stronger standards for all new baby furniture, tougher materials, fixed sides, and mandatory testing before approval. What had once been a must-have baby product suddenly became illegal overnight. The ban also marked a major cultural shift. Parents started questioning other nursery staples that had gone unexamined for years: bumper pads, old bassinets, soft bedding, and toys left in cribs. Safety became the new selling point. Manufacturers began designing around stability and simplicity, not just style. Currently, the drop-side crib stands as a cautionary tale about convenience and trust. A baby product was banned after decades of use, but that's exactly what happened. Many families kept theirs for sentimental reasons, unaware that it could be deadly. Modern parents wouldn't dream of using one now. In hindsight, it's chilling to think how something designed with love could carry such risk. It's a reminder that safety evolves and that some comforts are better left in the past. 18. Glass soda bottles that could explode or shatter easily. Long before plastic bottles and aluminum cans took over, soda came in thick glass bottles sealed with metal caps. They looked classy, clinked nicely in a cooler, and made that perfect hiss when opened. Every brand, from Coca-Cola to local soda makers, used glass because it was cheap, reusable, and everywhere. But those bottles carried a hidden danger few people thought about. They could explode without warning. In the 1950s and 60s, bottling plants didn't have the precise pressure controls we rely on today. Carbonation levels varied, and when bottles were overfilled or exposed to heat, the pressure inside built up fast. Sometimes, the glass couldn't take it. A single bottle could burst with enough force to send shards flying like shrapnel. Workers at bottling plants were the first to notice. Cuts, eye injuries, and deep lacerations were common. But even at home, people reported bottles exploding in pantries or back seats of hot cars. Opening one wasn't always safe either. Twist the cap too fast, or drop the bottle by accident, and it could crack or pop violently in your hand. There were even cases where children were hurt just carrying soda from the fridge. The risk was so widespread that some families kept their bottles in buckets of cold water, hoping to keep the pressure down. Eventually, manufacturers began phasing in stronger glass formulas and automated bottling systems that measured carbonation more accurately. Even so, the problem never fully went away until packaging technology changed completely. The rise of lightweight plastic and aluminum in the 1970s and 80s finally ended the era of exploding glass sodas. Glass bottles still exist, but they're engineered with modern safety standards. You won't find them popping in your trunk or bursting in your kitchen anymore. Still, anyone who grew up in that earlier era remembers it vividly. The satisfying clink of glass, the fizz at the lip, and that little twinge of fear when one exploded out of nowhere. It's one of those small, forgotten hazards from the past that reminds us how much safety we now take for granted. 19. Backyard burning of trash in open barrels or pits. Before weekly garbage collection and recycling trucks were part of everyday life, people handled waste the simplest way they could, by burning it. All across the 1950s, 60s, and even into the 70s, it was common to see metal barrels in backyards smoldering with paper, plastic, and food waste. The smell of smoke hung in the air, and nobody thought twice about it. Some families even saw it as a Saturday chore: rake the leaves, clean the yard, and burn the trash. At first, it seemed harmless. Burning reduced waste volume and kept rodents away. It was free, easy, and quick. But what people didn't realize was that they were creating toxic clouds right in their neighborhoods. Plastic packaging, rubber, paint, and treated paper release dangerous chemicals like dioxins, carbon monoxide, and lead when burned. These fumes didn't drift away. They settled on lawns, gardens, and playgrounds, contaminating soil and water. The health risks weren't immediately obvious, but over time, the evidence grew. Doctors began noticing higher rates of respiratory illnesses and skin problems in areas where open burning was common. Fire departments also reported countless house and brush fires started by unattended burn barrels. What was meant to save time often ended in accidents or pollution that affected entire communities. By the 1970s, environmental awareness was finally catching up. Cities began rolling out waste collection systems in landfills, while the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, pushed for bans on open burning. Over the next few decades, state after state outlawed backyard trash fires, replacing them with recycling programs and regulated disposal. Rural areas followed more slowly, but the shift was inevitable. Open burning is now illegal in most residential zones, with fines for anyone caught doing it. Modern waste management may seem mundane, but it has replaced one of the most widespread environmental hazards in American history. What was once seen as a practical habit is now viewed as reckless. Those old burn barrels, rusted, smoky, and toxic, stand as a reminder of how ignorance and convenience can cloud good judgment, quite literally. 20. No rural speed limits or loosely enforced speed laws. There was a time when driving fast wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. In the wide open stretches of rural America, speed limits were often non-existent. Roads cut through farmland and empty plains, with few signs and even fewer patrols. Drivers treated them like racetracks, testing how far the needle could go before the engine gave up. Going 80 or 90 miles an hour didn't seem reckless. It just felt like freedom. For decades, many states either had no posted limits in rural areas or used vague terms like reasonable and prudent. That phrase gave drivers plenty of room to decide what reasonable meant. Enforcement was light too. Local sheriffs often looked the other way unless someone caused a crash. Car advertisements of the 1950s and 60s even played into the mindset, bragging about top speeds and horsepower, as if the open road were a proving ground. But the consequences started showing up fast. As cars became faster and highways longer, fatalities climbed. Rural crashes were often the deadliest, with long response times, no seatbelts, and speeds too high for the road conditions. Yet change didn't come quickly. It took the 1970s oil crisis and a rising death toll to make the government take speed seriously. In 1974, the U.S. introduced the National Maximum Speed Law, setting a federal limit of 55 miles per hour. It wasn't popular, but it worked. Studies showed a sharp drop in fatal crashes almost immediately. The limit also reduced fuel consumption at a time when gas prices were soaring. Though states eventually regained the right to set their own limits in the 1990s, most never went back to the lawless days of drive as fast as you like. Speed limits vary, but the culture around driving has changed. Enforcement is stricter, safety campaigns are constant, and modern cars track speed with digital precision. What was once seen as a harmless adventure is now recognized as one of the biggest contributors to fatal accidents. 21. Hunting without licenses or formal regulation. Before wildlife management laws existed, hunting was treated more like a personal right than a regulated activity. In the 1940s, 50s, and even into the early 60s, few people needed a license, and seasons were loosely enforced, if at all. Farmers hunted year-round to protect crops, families filled freezers with game, and young kids learned to shoot as soon as they could hold a rifle. It wasn't seen as sport. It was part of daily life. At first, it made sense. Many rural communities relied on hunting to survive. Deer, rabbits, ducks, and fish were a vital source of food and income. But without regulation, overhunting became a serious problem. Some species were wiped out from entire regions, while others teetered on the edge of extinction. Passenger pigeons, once numbering in the billions, vanished completely. Even deer populations, which seem abundant today, nearly disappeared in several states. As awareness grew, conservationists began sounding alarms. Groups like the Boone and Crockett Club and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pushed for change. They argued that hunting needed structure, not to take away tradition, but to preserve it. Slowly, states began introducing licensing systems, bag limits, and hunting seasons designed to balance wildlife populations. By the 1970s, those efforts had transformed the landscape. Hunters now had to complete safety courses, register their firearms, and follow strict seasonal rules. Penalties for illegal hunting or poaching became severe, ranging from heavy fines to loss of hunting privileges. And instead of opposing regulation, many hunters supported it. They realized sustainable hunting wasn't about restriction. It was about ensuring there would always be something left to hunt. Legal hunting plays a major role in wildlife conservation. License fees fund habitat restoration and species protection programs across the country. The modern hunter understands their responsibility to the land, not just their right to use it. 22. Unregulated public pools and lakes. No lifeguards, no fences. Decades ago, swimming was simple. You found a lake, quarry, or backyard pool, and you jumped in. There were no fences, no warning signs, and often no lifeguards. Kids spent hours in the water while parents chatted nearby, or stayed home altogether. Communities didn't worry much about supervision. People believed common sense was enough to stay safe. Unfortunately, it wasn't. In the 1950s and 60s, drownings were one of the leading causes of accidental death among children. Many public pools were poorly maintained or overcrowded, and lakes had unpredictable currents, sharp rocks, or sudden drop-offs. When someone got into trouble, help wasn't always close. Lifeguards were seen as optional luxuries, not necessities. Some towns didn't even have emergency equipment on site. The situation started to change as awareness grew. Hospitals began tracking drowning cases, and the numbers were alarming. Public health experts and insurance companies pushed for tighter safety standards. Gradually, laws required fences around residential pools, signage warning of deep or unsafe areas, and certified lifeguards at community facilities. Training programs emerged to teach water rescue, CPR, and supervision practices. What had once been a casual summer activity became a regulated environment. Still, resistance was strong at first. Many people saw the new rules as overreach. "We swam there for years and nobody died," was a common defense. But tragedies continued to make headlines, and local governments realized prevention was cheaper and more humane than dealing with loss afterward. Nowadays, an unfenced pool, or a lake, is without warning markers. Building codes require barriers, drain covers, and rescue gear. Even small hotel pools must meet safety regulations. And while drownings still occur, the rates have dropped dramatically, thanks to those protections. 23. Parents smoking around children. Casually at home. For much of the 20th century, cigarette smoke was part of the household atmosphere, literally. Parents smoked at the dinner table, in the living room, even in the car with the windows rolled up. Guests brought their own packs. Ashtrays sat on every coffee table, and the smell of tobacco clung to curtains, furniture, and clothes. Nobody thought of it as harmful. If anything, it was a social habit, something adults simply did. The idea that secondhand smoke could hurt others didn't enter public conversation until decades later. In the 1950s and 60s, tobacco companies sponsored TV shows, printed cartoon ads, and even ran campaigns featuring doctors endorsing cigarette brands. That messaging made smoking seem safe, even sophisticated. Meanwhile, children grew up breathing the same air day and night. The health effects took years to fully reveal themselves. By the 1980s, studies began connecting secondhand smoke to asthma, ear infections, respiratory illness, and sudden infant death syndrome. The numbers were shocking. Children of smokers were far more likely to develop chronic health problems before reaching adulthood. What had seemed like a harmless adult habit turned out to be a quiet, constant danger for everyone nearby. As the data spread, attitudes changed fast. Public health campaigns began targeting not just smokers, but parents in particular. Commercials showed the invisible impact of smoke hanging in the air long after a cigarette was stubbed out. Hospitals and pediatricians joined in, urging families to make homes and cars smoke-free zones. Laws soon followed, banning smoking in restaurants, schools, and public spaces. Even lighting up inside your own car with a child present became illegal in many places. What was once routine is now seen as reckless. Parents who do smoke often step outside, understanding the responsibility that comes with protecting their kids' health. 24. Leaded gasoline. Widely used and sold. For much of the 20th century, cars everywhere ran on leaded gasoline. Gas stations proudly advertised it as ethyl fuel, and drivers loved it because it made engines run smoother and quieter. Nobody thought twice about what that extra ingredient,
tetraethyl lead, was doing to the air, the soil, or the people breathing nearby.
It was just the way things worked. The problem was invisible, but devastating. Burning leaded gasoline released fine lead particles into the air, coating streets, playgrounds, and farmland. Over time, it builds up in the body, damaging the brain, nervous system, and organs. Children were the most vulnerable. In the 1960s, pediatricians started noticing high levels of lead in kids living near highways and industrial zones. Behavioral problems, learning delays, and health issues all trace back to the same source: the exhaust pipe. At first, oil companies denied everything. They insisted that leaded gas was safe and dismissed scientists who warned otherwise. For decades, their message drowned out early environmental voices. But research kept piling up, and by the 1970s, the truth was undeniable. Leaded fuel was poisoning millions of people. The United States began phasing it out in 1975 under new Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, rules. Other countries followed, though some continued selling it well into the 2000s. In 2021, the United Nations finally declared the end of leaded gasoline worldwide after nearly a century of use. The change came late, but it marked a major public health victory. The difference is measurable. Cities saw dramatic drops in childhood lead levels, crime rates linked to lead exposure fell, and air quality improved across the globe. Today, unleaded fuel is the norm, and most people can't even imagine pumping lead into the air we all breathe. It's astonishing how something once seen as progress could cause so much hidden damage. Leaded gasoline powered modern life, but it also poisoned it. The story of its rise and fall is a reminder that convenience and safety don't always travel in the same tank. 25. Corporal punishment in schools and homes. There was a time when discipline meant physical punishment. In the 1950s and 60s, teachers kept wooden paddles in classrooms, and parents saw spanking as a normal part of raising kids. Getting the belt or the switch wasn't unusual. It was expected. Adults believed a quick sting taught respect, and that strictness built character. A child sent to the principal's office knew exactly what was coming. Back then, few questioned the practice. Corporal punishment was seen as both effective and moral, often justified by tradition or religion. Many schools even had formal policies that allowed teachers to strike students for talking back, missing homework, or disrupting class. Parents rarely objected. In fact, most supported it, viewing it as teamwork between home and school. But over time, psychologists began studying the long-term effects, and the findings painted a darker picture. Physical punishment didn't teach discipline. It taught fear. Children who were hit regularly were more likely to struggle with anxiety, aggression, and trust. The emotional scars often lasted long after the bruises faded. By the 1980s, research in changing cultural values began shifting attitudes. Countries across Europe started banning corporal punishment in schools altogether. The movement reached the United States slowly. Many states left the decision to local districts, and even today, a handful of states technically allow it, though far fewer use it. In homes, the shift has been even more significant. Parenting experts now emphasize communication, boundaries, and positive reinforcement instead of physical force. Modern parents often look back on their own childhood punishments with mixed feelings. Some say it did them no harm, while others remember it as humiliation disguised as discipline. Either way, the world has changed. Society now recognizes that violence, even when well-intentioned, teaches the wrong lesson. 26. Dangerous playground equipment and unsupervised risky play. Playgrounds used to be a lot more dangerous than they are today. Metal slides that baked under the sun, monkey bars stacked 2 stories high, spinning merry-go-rounds that threw kids off at full speed. These were the standard features of childhood in the 1960s and 70s. The idea of safety-tested equipment didn't exist. The ground was usually hard-packed dirt or concrete, and if you fell, you learned to dust yourself off and keep going. Parents watched from a distance, or not at all. Supervision wasn't expected. Play was about freedom, toughness, and a few inevitable scrapes. Even schools had playgrounds filled with hazards, tall seesaws, chain swings, and climbing frames with no soft surface underneath. Kids raced to claim the tallest structure, or push the merry-go-round the fastest, while teachers casually chatted nearby. At the time, no one questioned it. Risk was part of growing up. The occasional broken arm or chipped tooth was just a story to tell later. But as cities grew and injury reports piled up, doctors and safety experts started pushing back. Hospitals began tracking playground-related accidents, and the data was eye-opening. Tens of thousands of children ended up in emergency rooms each year. Some didn't survive. By the 1980s and 90s, playground design went through a complete overhaul. Asphalt and dirt were replaced with rubber mats and mulch. Equipment was lowered, guardrails added, and sharp edges removed. Federal safety standards were introduced, requiring specific height limits, spacing, and surface materials. Playgrounds became safer. Though some parents complained, they'd become too sanitized. 27. Unsupervised. Trick-or-treating and free roaming of kids at night. There was a time when kids had almost total freedom after dark. On Halloween, groups of children would wander entire neighborhoods without a single adult in sight, clutching pillowcases and plastic pumpkins. They crossed streets, knocked on strangers' doors, and disappeared for hours. Parents didn't worry much. They just said, "Be home by 9," and trusted that everyone would make it back. It wasn't just Halloween. In the 1960s and 70s, it was common for kids to play outside until the streetlights came on. Even on school nights, they roamed parks, construction sites, and back alleys, places most parents today would never allow. That freedom built confidence and independence, but it also came with risks no one talked about. Accidents, kidnappings, and crimes involving children were far more common than people realized. Yet the cultural attitude was, kids will be kids. Over time, that mindset started to shift. In the late 1970s and 80s, media coverage of child abductions and missing person cases hit national headlines. Names like Eaton Patz and Adam Walsh became tragic symbols of lost innocence. Parents everywhere started tightening boundaries. Neighborhoods introduced curfews. Schools added safety programs. Trick-or-treating became a supervised family event instead of a solo adventure. Cities also changed their approach. Police departments began promoting safe house initiatives and organized community events like mall trick-or-treating. Meanwhile, new laws cracked down on sex offenders, and awareness campaigns taught children about stranger danger. By the 1990s, the days of roaming free until midnight were long gone. Some older generations still remember those nights fondly. The laughter, the independence, the feeling of owning the world for a few hours. But most parents today wouldn't trade modern safety for nostalgia. GPS trackers, phone calls, and curfews have replaced blind trust. The world hasn't necessarily become more dangerous. It's just more aware. Childhood freedom gave way to caution, and Halloween became a family outing instead of a wild night out with friends. 28. Lack of car seats and child safety restraints. For most of the 20th century, kids rode in cars like mini adults, or worse, like cargo. There were no laws, no booster seats, and often no seatbelts in the back. Babies sat on laps. Toddlers stood on seats to get a better view of the road. If a parent slammed on the brakes, the instinctive reaction was to throw an arm across the child's chest, as if that could stop the momentum of a moving car. The first car seats weren't built for safety at all. In the 1950s, they were designed simply to lift a child high enough to see out the window. They were made of metal frames and thin padding, offering zero protection. It wasn't until the 1960s that a few doctors began raising concerns about child injuries and crashes. Their warnings were brushed off at first. Seatbelts were still optional for adults after all. Then came the data. Hospitals and researchers started documenting how many children were killed or severely injured in car accidents each year. The numbers were staggering. By the early 1970s, safety advocates began pushing for regulation, leading to the first proper crash-tested car seats. Even then, adoption was slow. Many parents resisted, saying, "We never had car seats growing up, and we turned out fine." But awareness grew as public service campaigns and tragic stories made the risks impossible to ignore. Laws started rolling out state by state through the 1980s and 90s, requiring children to be secured in age-appropriate restraints. Manufacturers responded with better designs, 5-point harnesses, energy-absorbing foam, side impact protection, and strict testing standards. Today, a child is riding unrestrained in a moving car. Modern car seats are marvels of engineering, capable of saving lives in ways early drivers couldn't dream of. What's shocking is how recent this change really is. Just a few decades ago, safety meant a parent's arm and a prayer. Now, it's a carefully engineered system built to keep kids alive. 29. Smoking in cars and public spaces. There was a time when smoke was part of the scenery. You could walk into a diner, a movie theater, or even a hospital waiting room and see people lighting up without a second thought. Airplanes had smoking sections. Office desks came with ashtrays. Even city buses and taxis smelled faintly of tobacco. It wasn't just allowed, it was expected. The world was wrapped in a haze, and nobody thought it was strange. Cars were no exception. Parents smoked with the windows up, filling the air with a thick fog that kids quietly coughed through in the back seat. Friends lit cigarettes on road trips. Salesmen puffed away between client calls. The smell soaked into everything: clothes, upholstery, hair. And yet it was considered normal. Public space belonged equally to smokers and non-smokers, and those who didn't like it were told to sit somewhere else. The change didn't happen overnight. It began with small discoveries, scientists linking tobacco use to lung cancer, heart disease, and secondhand smoke exposure. By the 1970s, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Restaurants started introducing non-smoking sections, though the air is usually mixed anyway. Airplanes followed suit in the 1980s, and offices soon after. The real turning point came when public health campaigns made the issue personal. Posters showed children breathing secondhand smoke in cars. Ads compared smoking in public to poisoning the air around strangers. Cities began passing smoking bans in bars, restaurants, and workplaces. Eventually, the movement reached vehicles, and laws made it illegal to smoke in a car if a child was present. At first, smokers saw it as an invasion of personal freedom, but as the air cleared, people realized what they'd been living with. The smell that once clung to everything now feels suffocating when encountered again. Now, smoke-free spaces are the norm. Many cities ban smoking entirely within public buildings and parks. What was once an everyday habit is now confined to designated corners and balconies. The clean air we take for granted today was earned one ashtray ban at a time. 30. Using asbestos in homes, schools, and everyday products. For decades, asbestos was everywhere, and almost nobody knew how dangerous it was. From the 1940s through the 1970s, it was the miracle material of the modern world. It didn't burn, it didn't rust, and it added strength to anything it touched. Builders mixed it into cement, sprayed it onto ceilings for insulation, and tucked it inside walls and attics. It showed up in floor tiles, brake pads, hair dryers, and even ironing boards. Safety seemed to be its greatest feature, but the very fibers that made asbestos so durable were deadly once disturbed. When inhaled, they lodged deep in the lungs and stayed there for decades. Over time, they caused serious diseases: lung cancer, asbestosis, and mesothelioma, a cancer almost exclusively linked to asbestos exposure. The danger wasn't just in factories. Construction workers, teachers, and homeowners were all unknowingly breathing in microscopic dust every day. Early warnings were ignored. By the 1930s, some doctors already suspected a link between asbestos and lung disease, but the booming post-war construction industry dismissed the findings. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that public health researchers finally proved what had been feared all along. Asbestos was a silent killer. Regulations were followed, but slowly. The United States began restricting its use in the late 1970s, banning most spray-on applications and insulation materials. Other countries moved faster, outlawing it completely. Even so, many older buildings still contain asbestos today, hidden behind paint or under floors. Renovations in schools and homes often uncover it decades later, requiring professional removal to prevent contamination. Asbestos is banned or heavily restricted in most nations. Workers handling older materials must wear protective gear, and strict laws govern how it's disposed of. But the legacy remains. Thousands of people still suffer from illnesses caused by exposure that happened half a century ago. Wow, how something once praised for protecting people from fire ended up slowly killing them instead. The asbestos story speaks that not every innovation is progress, and that real safety sometimes means questioning what everyone else calls safe.